America. Welcome back to the Eric Farris Show. All right, we're going to tackle a topic that kind of cuts between people here. And a lot of this has to do with federalism. A lot of this has to do with just basic disagreements that are out there in the American public as to issues of marijuana is what we're talking about. We're talking to Dan Viets. He's been on the show before. He's an attorney in Columbia, Missouri, and he's also the chair of Show Me Cannabis. And, you know, this is an issue, and we're going to open the studio lines up and take calls on this as well. That studio line number for our listeners is 417-330-1063. A lot of opposition out there that would say that marijuana is a gateway drug. It opens up into other things. We'll talk to Dan about that. We'll talk about hemp. What is hemp production? How does that differ from marijuana? And then ultimately, we're going to get into talking about the fact that it could be on the November 2014 a ballot. There could be a variety of proposals that may be before you as a voter in Missouri. If you're listening to us from Missouri, you may be able to vote on the issues of legalization or decriminalization. And we'll talk about those differences with Dan Viets as well. All right, so at this time, let's welcome to the show, back to the show again, Dan Viets. Dan, hey, welcome to the show. How are you today?
Very well, Eric. Thank you very much.
All right, so Dan, I appreciate you've come back and you've been with us on the show, and I want to kind of tackle some elementary type questions first before we get into talking about some of these other issues. But the first thing is I want you to help us identify and understand in Colorado and Oregon, what did those state governments put into place, and talk about the difference between criminalization, decriminalization, and legalization. What is in effect? Let's start first with Colorado and Oregon, and then we'll kind of go from that to what may or may not happen in Missouri, okay?
Sure.
In those two states, what happened?
I'm sure you know that. It's Washington and Colorado.
There we go, Washington. You're right.
Yeah, have legalized marijuana in the sense that it is taxed and regulated in a manner similar to alcohol, and that's exactly what we're proposing here in Missouri as well. The primary difference between Colorado and Washington's laws is that in Colorado, individual adults are permitted to grow up to 6 plants for their personal use. Washington did not provide for that.
All right. So
we do intend to allow it under Missouri law, however.
Okay. All right. And so give us some feedback. And I know that you're speaking to us as chair. I mean, you know, you have a capacity that you're the chair of Show Me Cannabis. What are some of the feedback so far from what's happened in those two states, in Washington and Colorado? You know, has there been a slew of problems? Has there been a slew of anything that's gone detrimental, or has it just kind of gone off the way you would think that those efforts have gone once it's been written into law?
It's gone remarkably smoothly. The possession of marijuana by adults now has been legal in both of those states for well over a year. There are, as far as I'm aware, no evidence of any serious problems that have arisen because of that. You know, the primary fear people have when they talk about whether it's the gateway theory or driving under the influence or whatever evil it is that they imagine might come about if we stopped treating marijuana smokers like criminals. The most important point to bear in mind is there's no evidence that use increases, and that runs counter to people's assumption. Their gut feeling is, of course, more people will smoke it if it's not illegal. But the truth is the people who want to use marijuana are already using it, and nobody is out there saying, gosh, if the government just gave me permission, I sure would like to smoke marijuana. That has not happened. In 10 states, we decriminalized marijuana possession in the 1970s. We have 40 years of experience with decriminalizing marijuana, not a shred of evidence that use has increased where it's been decriminalized. Now, decriminalized, and I'm glad you asked me to distinguish these terms.
Yeah.
Decriminalizing marijuana generally means that one is not arrested for the possession of a small amount, one is not threatened with jail, and one does not wind up with a permanent public criminal conviction record. And legalization, on the other hand, means there's no penalty for responsible adult use, just like we can possess and use alcohol in a responsible manner if you're over 21. It also means, in the case of Colorado and Washington, that some form of regulated and taxed retail sale is also permitted.
All right, so let's dive into talking about the chief objection that I hear to marijuana is people say that it's a gateway drug, that you'll start using marijuana, and before you know it, you'll be freebasing heroin and smoking cocaine off mirrors and things like that. And I'm not trying to make light of the question. There are, I'm sure, gateway drugs, but is marijuana, in your opinion, a gateway drug?
Well, we've got to define the term first. What people who use that term really mean is it's going to cause more people to use other drugs. Well, what I just said, I think, refutes that. For one thing, there's going to be no more people using marijuana after it's legalized than there are now while it's illegal. So even if it were a so-called gateway, that effect would be no worse under regulation and taxation. But the reality is there's no evidence that marijuana causes people to use other drugs, legal or illegal. The reality is that, of course, you can say, well, almost everyone who uses cocaine has also used marijuana at some point. But those people have also used alcohol, and using alcohol didn't cause them to use cocaine. Using marijuana did not cause them to use cocaine. The reality also is that only a very tiny percentage of the people who use alcohol go on to use cocaine, and only a very tiny percentage of the people who use marijuana go on to use cocaine, just to use one example.
All right, so, Dan, let's talk about hemp, okay? And for people that are not as familiar with this, I want to kind of paint this picture of hemp versus marijuana. What's the difference? There's, as I understand it, a whole economy that could be out there through the industrial use of hemp. And my understanding is the Founding Fathers largely used hemp, but that it's been not allowed because of its association with marijuana. What's the difference, primarily, first, for our listeners?
Well, as defined under most state laws where hemp has been legislated about, it is a form of cannabis sativa containing less than 1% THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, considered to be the primary psychoactive ingredient in marijuana. It's a form of cannabis, in other words, that will not get you high, but is indeed extremely valuable for many agricultural and industrial uses, and was a major part of our economy right here in Missouri, right up through the end of the 1800s. It was in 1937 when cannabis was outlawed federally that the hemp industry likewise was eliminated, was wiped out overnight. There is a great deal of research that demonstrates that we could make great use of hemp today. The University of Missouri has done some research on so-called hempcrete, using the fibers in hemp to reinforce concrete. But it's interesting that just in the past week, the U.S. Senate passed the Farm Bill, and the President signed the Farm Bill. And one of the little-known aspects of the Farm Bill is that it contains a provision legalizing research on hemp. So I think we're going to see a great surge forward in interest in hemp in the near future.
Yeah, and on that story, I'm glad you got to that. I pulled up an article. I've got it here on my iPhone. That particularly that was welcomed in the state of Kentucky. Republican Congressman Thomas Massey, who I like a lot from the 4th Congressional District, got behind that amendment. Now, that gives the green light to state agricultural departments and colleges, universities to grow hemp for academic and agricultural research purposes. But as I understand it from this article, those new rules only apply to states that already have legalized industrial hemp farming. Where is Missouri on that?
Missouri needs to get on board, and we're very close. We're going to see in the next few weeks, we're going to see bills introduced in the Missouri General Assembly, both the House and Senate, most likely, to do exactly that, to authorize the cultivation and research into hemp in our state. Kentucky is ahead of us, and we shouldn't let them run away with this. In fact, there are at least a half dozen states now that have already passed bills that permit them to immediately go forward with hemp research, and we have reason to believe that the Missouri legislature very well may pass a bill like that this session. There's a great deal of support, as you mentioned, across party lines, and a great deal of interest among the Republican majority in the Missouri General Assembly in what hemp could do for our economy.
Let's talk about hemp products. What are typical type of hemp products? I understand, one of those is nutritional type products, milk and other things. Talk about the variety of hemp products that could be out there that may be available to consumers at some point in the future if this expands.
Sure. Well, the probably the best-known use is making rope, and rope indeed was one of the primary uses of the hemp plant when it was grown here in Missouri. The hemp oil, it also has uses. It was used in the 1800s as a base for paints. It was used for sealing ships. There are an incredible range of uses for various parts of the hemp plant. Virtually every part of the plant has industrial uses. The hurd, the soft inside of the stalk, is very useful for making paper, and it's a form of paper which is far more durable, far more long-lasting than paper that we use now, made from high acid content trees. Books that have been made from hemp paper before trees began to be used are much, much stronger, much more well-preserved than books that are only a few decades old but made from high acid content tree material. In addition to uses as paper, I mentioned that the outside of the stalk contains the fiber, which is useful for rope, which is useful for reinforcing concrete. The oils, which are taken from the seeds, the female plant produces a great amount of seed if it's grown in its normal form, not a sinsemilla for smoking. But the seeds contain oils, which, as you mentioned, contain some highly nutritious components. The feed, the food that is made from hemp seed can be especially nutritious.
All right, so let me ask you this. For our Missouri listeners particularly, and agriculture is a big part of our economy in this state, concerning the growing of hemp as an agricultural or industrial product, is there something about the soil in Missouri, in certain areas? I mean, I know that we have a wine country because there are certain aspects of Missouri that lends itself well to the growing of vines for wine. Are there certain areas in the state that may be more successful at growing hemp if it's available to do on an agricultural or industrial product?
Well, I would say that northwestern Missouri is probably the most probably the best area, and I say that largely because hemp continues to grow there today. Up in northwest Missouri, you'll find that hemp plants grow anywhere that it's not cultivated, basically. I grew up on a small farm in northwest Missouri, and I was astounded when I came home from college to realize that all during my childhood I was surrounded by hemp plants because you can't stop them from growing up there. They're in every fence row and every uncultivated area of the earth almost has hemp plants on it. It's a very hardy plant, very strong plant. It grows well where there is adequate moisture, so that's one reason why Missouri is a good place for growing hemp.
All right, so Dan, let's change our topic and let's move back into this issue of marijuana legalization and whether that may come to Missouri. You personally recently submitted to the Missouri Secretary of State's office some initiative petitions seeking approval to start collecting signatures to place some of these ballot initiatives, these ballot questions, on the ballot for November of 2014. And I understand that the Secretary of State's office has approved that basic language. You've still got to get a necessary amount of signatures. Explain, and I think there's 13 different measures. Explain what you've done and explain what has happened and those measures, please.
They are all basically variations on the same theme. All of those various forms that we submitted that petition in are basically going to tax and regulate marijuana like alcohol. The differences come in the number of plants that a person would be able to cultivate for his or her own personal use. Differences relate to whether or not we would release people from prison who are currently serving time for things that are no longer a crime, whether we would allow the expungement of the past records of people convicted of marijuana offenses. But basically, they're all the same. They would all create a Colorado-style legalization situation. People would be able to possess a limited amount of cannabis in various forms for personal use. They would be allowed to cultivate a limited number of plants for personal use. And with authorization, with licensing and strict regulation, retailers would be allowed to sell cannabis in much the same way they're allowed to sell alcohol.
All right, so these initiative petitions, there's 13 individual petitions. Secretary of State Jason Kander has announced last month that all of them has met the state standards and has allowed your organization to begin to collect signatures. Is that correct?
That's true, but we're not collecting signatures yet.
Okay.
And the next step, the step we are currently engaged in, is polling. We are polling likely November 2014 voters. We expect to know within just a couple of weeks what the numbers show. If it appears that we could achieve a majority of close to 60% among likely November 2014 voters, we will go forward this year. If not, then we will go forward in 2016 when we're virtually certain that we would have that majority.
All right. Now, my understanding, and I want to ask you, I mean, I've got the information on this. The information financially about the cost and the revenue increases, is that something that was done by your organization, or is that something that's been researched at the state government level?
Both. There are two good sources on that right now. One is available on our website, showmecannabis.org. You'll see right there on the homepage a link to a study done by Harvard economist Jeffrey Myron. Jeffrey Myron has estimated conservatively that between the amount of money we would save that's currently wasted on law enforcement and prosecution and imprisonment and supervision of people for marijuana, and taking into account the new tax revenue, that the state would realize a $150 million bonus each year. But more recently, and in the process of reviewing these petitions that we filed to possibly put this issue on the ballot, the state auditor's office has also done its own independent estimate based on some specific estimates from various departments of state government. The estimate that our state auditor has come up with is that there would be $142 million in new revenue alone, and not even taking into account the great amount that would be saved in law enforcement costs.
Well, I mean, when you start looking at an increase of, and looking at these numbers, $142 million more coming into the state coffers, or even the other increase that's cited here is exceeding $217 million. When you're talking about a state that's already having budget shortfalls and difficulties, it looks like that would help.
Absolutely, it would help. In fact, it's been pointed out that $150 million is roughly what our state spends on community colleges each year. It would do a tremendous amount of good. It would help us to provide health care to people who need it, help us to build roads and bridges, help us to provide education. In fact, that's specifically what our initiatives say, that this money would have to be spent on. A certain percentage would go to education, a certain percentage would go to law enforcement and firefighters' pension funds, which are threatened right now. Certain percentages would go into drug treatment and counseling, but the legislature would still have some discretion as to exactly how to allocate that money.
Okay. All right, so let's dive into this. There's also some pending bills in the Missouri legislature. I believe they've been filed by State Representative Chris Kelly right there in your hometown of Columbia, Missouri. Other than you going through this initiative process, what's going on in Jeff City in the legislature as to some of these issues as well?
You're exactly right. There are two fronts in this battle right now, the battle to end marijuana prohibition in Missouri, and the second front is the Missouri General Assembly. Representative Chris Kelly filed a bill which is essentially the same as our initiatives. It's a bill that, again, would establish a Colorado-style taxation and regulation scheme for cannabis in our state. It would also allocate the money, as I've just outlined, for education and for other worthy causes, and it would end the terrible waste of money and the terrible disruption of people's lives that goes on right now. I'm an attorney who represents largely people charged with marijuana offenses, and so I see this every week in my practice, that the people charged with marijuana crimes right now are good people. They're very nice people. They're people who, for the most part, have never been in trouble with the law over anything else, and it just does us no good to treat them as if they were criminals. You know, right now, people get the same punishment for relatively small marijuana crimes that we hand out to people who commit serious violent crimes and who steal other people's property. The law makes no distinction right now. It makes no sense either.
All right, so is the bills that have been filed by Chris Kelly, who's a Democrat, Have they been co-sponsored? And particularly, I mean, for legislative success in Jeff City, you got to have a bipartisan approach a lot of times. Do you see that moving forward? I mean, I'm thinking particularly some of the guests that we've had on the show, very, limited government, libertarian type of state representatives, such as Paul Kurtman, Nick Marshall, and others. And I know Nick Marshall and Chris Haley have had their differences on issues. Do you see there could be there could be an agreement moving forward that would result in maybe a passage by the House in a bipartisan fashion of some of these bills?
Yes, absolutely. It has to be bipartisan. Frankly, I applaud and appreciate Chris Kelly's courage and his vision in filing this bill. And nothing would please us more, including Chris Kelly. Nothing would please us more than to have Republicans pick up the ball and run with it. We would love to have Republican co-sponsors. You're right that Representative Kurtman has indicated he's open-minded on this type of thing, but he's not ready to co-sponsor a bill as yet. I hope we'll encourage him, and he'll reach that point in the near future. And there are other bright, young, especially young Republicans who do understand this issue, who do see that it is consistent with conservative philosophy, that if people who claim they want limited government, that claim that they want the government out of our private lives, would understand that that's exactly what we're fighting for here, I think we would have that coalition already. In fact, recent polling indicates that a majority of Americans do favor taxing and regulating marijuana like alcohol already.
I know that we have a text line. Let me give that number out for our listeners and check in with our listeners. Our text line number is 417 area code 699-8446. Let me check in with our listeners and let them know we're talking to Dan Viets. He's an attorney in Columbia, Missouri. He's also with the Show Me Cannabis. We're talking about the push for legalization of marijuana in Missouri. One of the things I wanted to point out, we did have a text line number that pointed out they didn't have a problem. This listener did, as long as it was for people of at least 21 years of age, to set the same type of standard as you had for alcohol. My understanding, Dan, is that is what the proposed language is on the initiatives that you turned in as Secretary of State. Is that correct?
You are correct. That's exactly right.
Okay. All right. Also, we got a text line number of 9343 who wants to contribute. Says, personally, they wouldn't mind a trade-off, make cigarettes illegal and legalize marijuana. It's an interesting perspective. So, Dan, let's talk about the next step is polling. So are you doing an outside polling group to do that? How is that being done?
Yes, we're hiring a nationally known and respected, highly qualified scientific sampling. We don't want to fool ourselves into thinking we can pass this when we can't, so you can be certain that we're doing our best to get a true and objective assessment of what our chances would be to win this fall. And frankly, the people that might be willing to contribute substantial amounts of money to this campaign aren't going to do it unless they believe we can win. So that's the name of the game. We want to know the truth. We want to know whether we're at that point yet where we could win this election. Now, keep in mind, the people who vote in off-year elections, when there's not a presidential race, are different demographically. So it's not just a matter of, whether we have a majority. It's, do we have a majority of those rather highly politicized people who actually vote when there's not a presidential race going on? We can win in 2016. We're not as certain that we can win in 2014, but we hope we can.
All right, one last fundamental question I've got for you, and I want to know what's happened in Washington and Colorado, is some are going to say, well, hey, there's federal law. If the feds step in, regardless of what the state does, has that happened in Colorado and Washington, and would that be a concern moving forward if the state of Missouri legalized marijuana on these initiative petitions?
Well, it would certainly be a concern, but we know now the Obama Justice Department, bless its heart, with respect for states' rights, has declared it's not going to interfere with states who tax and regulate marijuana like alcohol. Now, they've made it clear that they're not going to endorse a free-for-all. They want to be reassured that there are true limitations on sales to young people, that organized crime is not involved, that there aren't large amounts going across state lines, and we're fine with all of that. So, this is one of those areas, again, where conservatives and progressives have common cause. Conservatives, and certainly national polls have shown that 2/3 of Americans, even many who don't believe in marijuana legalization, do believe the states should be free to make up their own minds and set their own policies. And I think Obama deserves a little credit, at least, for declaring a policy of allowing that to happen.
Well, Dan, and we're both practicing attorneys, I look at the Constitution, and I don't see actually authority being given in the Constitution to the federal government to create anti-drug laws.
That's right.
And in fact, it's interesting that once upon a time in America, we recognized that, which is why we passed the 18th Amendment to give the Volstead Act to prohibit alcohol. At one point in time, we recognized that, but it seems that at some point in time, we quickly lost our memory, and we forgot that. And so that's where I am on the issue. Is I don't think that the Constitution gives the federal government the authority, and it leaves it to the states, which should be laboratories, and left individually to the states to decide if they want to do that or not.
Exactly right. And it's really the Supreme Court, of course, that decides these things. And there was an interesting case just a couple of years ago where the Supreme Court faced the question of whether somebody who grows marijuana in a state, that marijuana never leaves the state, they're using it for medical purposes pursuant to state law, does the federal government have the right to come in and interfere with that? And the Supreme Court said they do. Clarence Thomas, bless his heart, said they don't, but the majority said that the Congress has that authority. So, you know, other than congressional self-restraint, which I don't have a lot of faith in, it's going to be up to the Supreme Court to change that interpretation, of course.
Dan, you've been a great guest. I want our listeners to check out showmecannabis.org. And Dan, appreciate you being on the program again.
Thank you, Eric. Anytime. Have a good day.
Hey, we're going to take a break. We're going to wrap things up to the top of the hour right here on The Eric Farris Show. When we come right back, Farris Show. When we come right back, Farris Show. When we come right back, Farris Show. When we come right